The first time it happened, I thought it was a trick of the lights bouncing off the water, but the shape in the corner of my frame didn't move like any fish I knew. My camera captured it perfectly, yet when I lowered it, nothing was there, just the black swell pressing against the hull. I remember a whisper in my own thoughts, almost a warning about 11 strange rules I'd have to follow if I wanted to make it back alive. I shouldn't have ignored the first one, but curiosity always outweighed caution. Now I can't tell if the shadows are real, or if they're waiting for me to make the next mistake. The first time I heard it whispered through the cramped walls of the dive lab, I laughed. I was a rookie then, convinced that experience could override superstition. And besides, everyone said the deep only respected precision, not rules. But that night, descending into the abyss with my camera rig strapped tight against my chest, I felt the cold press of the water like a weight I couldn't fight. I twisted the dial without thinking, trying to capture the faint pulse of bioluminescence, and immediately remembered Rule 1. Never adjust the camera settings while the shutter is open. But it was too late. Something in the water shifted, deliberate and slow, as though it had been waiting for me to make that single stupid choice. The jellyfish I had been photographing floated with a lazy rhythm at first, tentacles drifting, their glow painting ghostly patterns on the surrounding darkness. Then they jerked abruptly, almost violently, in unison, as if the water itself had recoiled. I tried to tell myself it was the current, or my imagination, yet my gut knew otherwise. My hands trembled, gripping the camera as the shadows at the periphery thickened unnaturally, clinging to the shapes like ink in water. Every movement I made seemed amplified, every flicker of light a response to my own actions, and I began to feel the weight of Rule 1 pressing down on me in a way I hadn't anticipated. Minutes felt like hours as I struggled to regain control of the camera, but every adjustment I made seemed to warp the light around me. Something was watching through the lens, not in a physical sense, but in the way the bioluminescent creatures danced in impossible patterns, leaving trails in places where no creature could logically be. I whispered to myself, just a glitch, just a glitch. But the water hummed differently now, denser, thick with intent. I couldn't move without creating ripples that lingered unnaturally, and I began to feel panic curl up inside me like a living thing, cold and patient. Then came the flickers along the hull. Not lights, exactly, but reflections of something outside, something impossibly close, shifting angles as if following me deliberately. My breathing hitched. I realized I had been holding it too long, afraid to adjust, afraid to move, yet knowing that any motion could invite it nearer. I thought of my training, of the endless safety protocols, but they felt irrelevant now. Rule 1 wasn't about technique, it was about survival, about respecting boundaries that had nothing to do with physics or logic, and I had ignored it. I tried to take a single photograph properly, holding the shutter steady, willing the camera to behave, and the moment I did, I saw it. A form blurred but unmistakable, lingered behind the jellyfish, unmoving despite my motions, perfectly aligned with the camera's focus. My stomach turned as I realized this presence wasn't part of the ocean. It had been there before I ever adjusted the dial, waiting for the mistake to draw my attention. I could feel it in the way the water seemed to pulse with me, an awareness that mirrored my own panic. My hands shook violently, and yet I couldn't stop taking pictures. Some irrational need to document, even as fear gripped every nerve. Time stretched, losing meaning. My dive computer ticked, but seconds and minutes became meaningless, irrelevant, as I floated in a suspended haze of dread. Each frame I captured seemed to contain something I hadn't noticed in the moment. Reflections, angles, impossible juxtapositions that defied logic. I whispered apologies into my regulator, to the creatures, to the water, to the abyss itself, but the only response was a shifting, deliberate presence that made the hair on my neck stand on end. The rules I had scoffed at in the lab were not arbitrary. They were instructions written by someone or something that understood the abyss in ways I could never comprehend. Eventually, I surfaced, gasping, drenched in sweat beneath the dive suit, my camera shaking in my grip. The onboard computer blinked normally, my colleagues chatting as if nothing had happened, but the images on my screen told a different story. Shadows stretched and lingered unnaturally, the faint forms of creatures, or something pretending to be creatures, etched into every frame. I wanted to delete them, to erase evidence of my stupidity, but a stubborn curiosity held me fast. I could feel the lingering effects of breaking Rule 1, a residue in my thoughts, a quiet pressure behind my eyes that made sleep impossible. Weeks later, reviewing footage obsessively, I realized my mistake had consequences I couldn't fully measure. Even outside the water, the camera seemed alive, capturing moments that didn't exist, displaying frames I had never taken. The deeper I dove into the footage, the more I noticed subtle inconsistencies, reflections that didn't match angles, shadows that lingered longer than they should, and creatures appearing where they never could. I tried to rationalize it, technical errors, fatigue, but logic failed. The first breach of Rule 1 had opened something, a small door in reality that refused to close. My personal life began to fracture. I couldn't sleep without checking the cameras, couldn't eat without glancing at the monitors, and conversations became a blur as my mind replayed the dive endlessly. Even minor adjustments, small gestures reminded me of that first misstep. I found myself pausing mid-motion, hand frozen over the dial, heart hammering as if I could feel the presence watching again. The ocean, my photographs, even my own home felt like extensions of that abyssal chamber, all warning me, all punishing me for ignoring Rule 1, and yet I returned, not out of bravery, not out of obsession. Something deeper, more compulsive, drew me back to the depths. Each dive reminded me that the rule wasn't about technique, it was about acknowledgement, a recognition of forces I could not fully see or name. I learned to breathe slowly, to move deliberately, to let the shutter complete without interference. But the memory of that first breach lingered, the shapes, the shadows, the impossible reflections, none of it left me. They were patient, waiting, reminding me silently of what happens when Rule 1 is broken. Even now, months later, I handle my equipment with a nervous precision I never had before. I catch myself staring at the shutter, my finger hovering, reluctant to make a choice that could invite the wrong attention again. The ocean itself seems alive in my memory, vast and patient, stretching endlessly with secrets I will never fully understand. I repeat the rule to myself in whispers during dives, a mantra to anchor me. Rule 1, never adjust the camera settings while the shutter is open. And yet, even repetition doesn't erase the unease, the sense that somewhere in some frame yet unrecorded, something is watching, waiting, and judging. I learned Rule 2, never photograph anything that moves against the current on the third dive, though I didn't understand it at the time. I had been trying to capture the delicate dance of plankton, drifting in the faint glow of my rig lights. And at first, everything seemed calm, almost hypnotic. Then I noticed a shimmer against the flow, subtle at first, like a small shadow that shouldn't have been there. Curiosity got the better of me, and I aimed my camera at it, tracking the unnatural motion, thinking I could outsmart some hidden quirk of the deep. The water around me thickened, but this time it wasn't just pressure, it felt alive, resisting, as though I had intruded on something that had been patient for centuries. The longer I filmed it, the more aware I became of my own mistakes. The object, if it could be called that, didn't move like any fish, jelly, or creature I had ever cataloged. It moved deliberately, ignoring the flow that carried everything else, and every frame I took seemed to make it more tangible. My fingers trembled on the rig, and I whispered under my breath that I should stop, that the old diver's superstition, the rules were never meant to be challenged. But the camera had a pull I couldn't resist, and I kept tracking the motion, measuring it, trying to understand what should have been impossible. By the time I realized the danger, the current had changed subtly, swirling in ways I hadn't expected, and the shape against it had grown larger, more defined, almost sentient. I could feel my pulse in the water, echoing through my suit, and the deeper I dove, the more distorted reality became. My dive partner was ahead of me, moving in the current, oblivious, while I lingered behind, mesmerized and terrified. Shadows that should have dissipated followed me, clinging to the edges of visibility, shapes that were both familiar and wrong. I knew then that Rule 2 was about more than photography. It was about respect, timing, and acknowledging boundaries set by forces far beyond human comprehension. The creature, if it was one, didn't make a sound, but the movement itself was communicative, insistent, and predatory. It was as though every pixel I captured on the camera drew attention to me, a magnet for something unseen. I tried to redirect the camera, to follow the flow of the water instead, but the temptation to chase the impossible against the current was too strong. My body tensed with each movement, my oxygen consumption spiking, my thoughts fracturing as I realized that ignoring the rule might have consequences I could not survive. The deep has patience. It does not forgive mistakes lightly. As I backed away, attempting to rejoin my partner, the water itself seemed to resist. Minor adjustments, the smallest gestures, were magnified, dragging my rig slightly off course, twisting the world around me into disorientation. The current, which had once been a simple companion to my descent, now felt like an opponent, pressing me toward shapes I did not want to encounter. I shouted to my partner, though my voice barely carried through the regulator, and in that moment, I felt utterly horrifyingly small, like a single bubble in a storm-tossed sea. Hours or what felt like hours later, when I finally reached the relative calm of the mid-water plateau, the camera still recorded the impossible. Frames showed the object moving against the flow, a perfect contradiction to the physics I understood, and I realized that nothing I had learned in classes, nothing from experience, could prepare me for this. I wanted to delete the footage, burn the memory, erase evidence, but the compulsion to understand it was stronger. The very act of filming seemed to bind me, and I could feel an invisible tether stretching from the lens into the darkness, pulling me back, whispering that the rule existed for a reason, and ignoring it invited consequences far larger than curiosity or fame. Even in the days after the dive, the memory haunted me. Every time I reviewed footage, the object appeared differently, as if it was aware of being watched, aware of me. The frames shifted subtly. In one, the shape was faint and distant. In the next, impossibly close, with edges that should have been impossible underwater. My hands shook when I adjusted the camera, my subconscious hyper-aware of even the smallest movement. The lesson was clear. Rule 2 wasn't about a simple technical restriction. It was a barrier between what I should meddle with and what was beyond me. Every violation left a mark, a trace in the mind that could not be erased. I began avoiding the current altogether, choosing locations where everything flowed predictably, rigidly adhering to my own observations. Yet, even in controlled conditions, the ocean had ways of reminding me that nothing stays safe. Subtle disturbances appeared in the peripheral vision of my camera, slight shifts in shadow, a glint of something against the expected motion, and my heart rate spiked involuntarily. I couldn't shake the feeling that the deep remembered my transgression, that it cataloged the times I ignored Rule 2, storing them somewhere just beyond the edge of perception. On one particularly long dive, I thought I had learned everything, had internalized every precaution, and yet a small reflection caught my eye, an object moving just slightly, against the flow. I froze, hand hovering over the camera, knowing that if I filmed it, the past would replay itself. I debated retreating, turning back toward my partner, but the instinct to document, to understand, battled against my fear. The ocean seemed to hold its breath with me, patient but insistent, waiting to see which choice I would make. Eventually, I chose caution, pulling myself slowly into the current, and allowing the mysterious object to drift past, unrecorded. The relief was immediate, though tempered by an uncomfortable awareness that I had been lucky. The water's resistance eased slightly, though not entirely, and the shadows that had followed seemed to recede, though never completely. I realized then that obeying Rule 2 was not about preventing danger. It was about delaying contact, maintaining a fragile equilibrium with forces I could barely perceive. Even months later, the lesson lingers. I cannot pass a school of plankton or a swirl of bioluminescent life without checking its flow first, measuring the invisible currents, and calculating whether my camera should even record it. The thought of capturing something moving against the current brings an uneasy pressure to my chest, a reminder that the abyss is patient and precise, and that violating its subtle laws carries consequences that reach far beyond any dive. The ocean has its own memory, and every frame I take resonates with what I have learned. Some things cannot be chased, cannot be recorded, cannot be understood on my terms, and the moment I forget that, I risk everything. I discovered Rule 3. Never illuminate reflective surfaces at extreme depths during a dive that started as routine. Mapping the wreckage of an old research sub, the water was almost glass-like that day. Unusually calm, and I couldn't resist adjusting my lighting rig to highlight what I thought were curious formations along the hull. At first, it was mesmerizing. Faint reflections shimmering across rusted panels, hints of objects I could barely make out. But then, the glints multiplied, appearing in angles that shouldn't exist, bouncing from corners that had no light source, creating echoes of myself, shadows within shadows, as if the ocean were imitating every movement I made. I froze, heart thumping, realizing that the reflections weren't just anomalies, they were sentient in a way I couldn't rationalize. The patterns shifted when I blinked or tilted my head, almost reacting to my own attention. The water around me felt denser, alive with observation, and I recalled the warning, Rule 3, never illuminate reflective surfaces at extreme depths. But it was already too late. Each frame I captured amplified the distortion, doubling and tripling the number of ghostly images, and I felt an oppressive awareness, like the abyss was cataloging my errors, marking me as someone who had ignored its subtle law. As I attempted to stabilize my camera, I noticed that the reflections weren't static. They moved independently, gliding against currents that didn't exist, stretching and compressing in impossible ways. I realized the surfaces themselves were irrelevant. What mattered was the act of shining light on them, of disturbing their unbroken dark. Every adjustment I made sent ripples across these impossible patterns, creating a feedback loop I couldn't anticipate or control. My breathing became shallow, panic pressing against my ribs, as the water felt heavier, almost sentient in its insistence that I had transgressed. The wreck seemed to come alive under the reflection, rusted panels twisting subtly, corroded metal bending against logic, and for the first time I considered leaving my camera behind entirely. But the need to record, to understand, was stronger than caution. Every photograph I took produced more anomalies, faces that weren't there, limbs in angles that made no anatomical sense, and shadows that followed trajectories inconsistent with physics. I whispered apologies into the regulator, though the water gave no response, no reassurance. Only the silence and the shifting reflections answered me. A quiet reminder of Rule 3. Hours passed, or what my instruments claimed were hours, as I tried to navigate the wreck without provoking more distortions. The reflective surfaces seemed endless, multiplying in every direction, creating corridors of mirrored illusions that trapped me visually, disoriented me spatially. I began to doubt my own memory, unsure whether a panel I'd passed moments ago had been in the same position, or whether the reflections had shifted it. Each frame I captured felt like it embedded me deeper into the environment, anchoring my presence in a web of perception I could not escape. At one point I noticed something, or someone, in the reflections that wasn't me. A shape lingered behind my camera rig, humanoid in form, but impossibly elongated, its features warped by water and light. I spun around in panic, but nothing was there. The realization hit me slowly. The reflections had memory, awareness, and perhaps intent. The more I illuminated them, the more persistent these forms became, until I could no longer distinguish my own movements from the distortions around me. Every instinct screamed to stop, to descend deeper into shadow and abandon the camera, yet I couldn't let go of documenting what I had already disturbed. When I tried to retrace my path toward the ascent, the wreck appeared altered. Panels that had been flat now seemed concave, surfaces bending toward me, as if to lure my attention back to the reflective anomalies. The shadows in the water thickened, lingering in ways they hadn't before, attaching themselves to the lines of light I wielded. The trickle of panic in my mind swelled into a tidal wave. I realized that Rule 3 wasn't just about preventing technical issues. It was about acknowledging forces in the deep that could manipulate perception, memory, and even reality itself. I had stepped beyond the line of observation into active interaction, and the abyss remembered. On surfacing, I couldn't shake the feeling that the reflections had followed me, that the distorted images I had captured weren't confined to my camera. At home reviewing the footage, the anomalies persisted, shifting slightly between playbacks. Shadows extended into corners of the frame that hadn't existed on the dive, and reflective shapes appeared in angles I could not possibly have illuminated underwater. Each viewing sent a pang of unease through me, as though my own equipment had become a conduit, a medium for something that resided beyond comprehension, and my violation of Rule 3 had opened that conduit. The psychological toll was immediate. Sleep became impossible. I would wake in the night, imagining the reflections moving along walls of my apartment, flickering in impossible angles, whispering threats I could not decipher. I found myself avoiding mirrors, polished surfaces, even puddles in the rain, fearing that I had invited attention to myself that extended far beyond the ocean. The boundary between memory and perception blurred. Sometimes I swore I could see the warped figures from the wreck, waiting in the corners of my vision, mocking my arrogance, reminding me why Rule 3 existed. Every subsequent dive became a careful negotiation of light, angles, and distance. I had to calculate everything: how much illumination to cast, which surfaces to avoid, how to anticipate reflective patterns that could trap my mind. The ocean no longer felt like a passive environment. It was deliberate, patient, punishing. My camera, once a tool of exploration, now felt like a tether, binding me to a presence I didn't understand, one that monitored every violation of its subtle laws. Even a fleeting glance at a shiny surface made my skin crawl, a constant reminder of the transgression I could never fully undo. Eventually, I realized that Rule 3 was not only about avoiding visual anomalies, it was about protecting my own perception, my sanity. Each dive carried a risk of interacting with forces that recorded, responded, and perhaps judged. The reflective surfaces, once passive, were active participants in a reality I could barely navigate, creating illusions that seemed to possess memory. Understanding this, even partially, allowed me to proceed with caution, though the shadow of my initial mistake lingered persistently. I never again took a photograph of anything that could reflect at extreme depths, but the memory of the distortions remained, etched into both camera and mind. Even now, when I review footage or prepare for a dive, my hands hesitate over lights, instinctively avoiding the slightest reflection. The ocean has a way of teaching lessons harshly, subtly, leaving marks in perception that last far longer than bruises or cuts. I still see the shapes in peripheral vision, feel the press of water in ways that don't match the environment, and sense the lingering awareness of that first misstep. The lesson of Rule 3 persists daily: to illuminate is to engage, to photograph is to invite, and the moment I shine on reflective surfaces at extreme depths, I risk being observed by forces I will never understand. I learned Rule 4. Never leave your dive line unattended on a day that started like any other, with calm waters and a seemingly routine mission photographing a deep-sea trench. My partner was ahead, checking instruments, while I drifted behind, documenting the contours of jagged rock faces. I thought I could step just a few meters away from the main line, confident in my tether, believing the current would hold me steady. The moment I loosened my grip, the water around me shifted subtly, a tug that was barely perceptible, but enough to make my stomach lurch. At first I convinced myself it was simply the natural sway of the trench, yet instinct screamed that I had made a mistake. Within seconds, I felt the tug grow stronger, and the current, previously gentle, began to twist against the line. Shadows along the walls elongated, moving in ways that defied logic, and I realized that by leaving the line unattended, I had opened myself to forces I could not anticipate. The camera rig pressed against my chest felt heavier, as though sensing the instability, and I instinctively reached back for the line. But the moment my hand let go of even the slightest tension, a shiver of wrongness ran through the water, a subtle sentient resistance that made me doubt the integrity of my own senses. The trench seemed aware of my negligence, and the longer I lingered without correction, the more it pressed its presence into my consciousness. I tried to reel myself closer, but the line, which should have been a lifeline, moved unpredictably. Every tug felt deliberate, responding to my hesitation, every twist of the rope amplified by some invisible force. I whispered apologies into the regulator, trying to convince myself it was a mechanical anomaly, yet the shadows lurking near the crevices seemed to lean closer, testing my fear, observing my panic. Rule 4 was no mere procedural caution. It was a boundary, a subtle marker between what the abyss tolerated and what it punished, and I had crossed it. The realization was suffocating, an oppressive weight that left my lungs struggling against the pressure of both water and dread. Minutes, or what felt like minutes, passed as I struggled to stabilize myself. The trench walls, normally static and predictable, began to shift subtly in my peripheral vision. Rusted metal from a sunken sub hung at impossible angles. Sediment floated upward for a moment before settling back, and the shadows in the corners seemed to thicken in response to my movements. Every effort to retrieve the line only intensified the tug, as if the ocean itself were testing me, warning me to respect Rule 4. I realized then that this was not a physical struggle alone. It was a negotiation with a force beyond comprehension, a living environment that memorized mistakes and responded in kind. The longer I lingered, the more distorted the trench became. Rock faces that had been linear now curved unnaturally, creating corridors that led nowhere, or perhaps to places that shouldn't exist. The shadows flickered, as though alive, shifting with a consciousness I couldn't define. My camera captured images I couldn't understand, frames where the lines seemed to stretch endlessly, where my own silhouette appeared twisted against the current, and where dark shapes clung to the rope, as if riding it like a current of their own. Panic and awe collided, making my fingers slip against the rough metal of the tether. I reminded myself again that Rule 4 was not optional, it was survival. In a desperate attempt to correct my error, I reached for the line, only to feel it pulse beneath my grip. The moment my hand touched it, the current eased slightly, then twisted again, testing my hold. My mind raced. If I lost grip entirely, if I let go again, would the abyss simply let me drift into some uncharted space, or was there a more deliberate consequence waiting? The thought of surrendering control, even momentarily, filled me with dread. The trench itself seemed to pulse with anticipation, and I realized that leaving the line unattended wasn't just a mechanical error, it was an invitation, a way of proving to the deep that I did not yet respect its rules. Time became meaningless. I drifted alongside the tether, my eyes darting constantly between shadows, reflections, and the faint luminescence of life clinging to rock surfaces. The further I moved, the more I sensed presences lingering in the periphery, shapes that didn't belong, forms that floated unnaturally in the current, almost like sentinels monitoring my attention. I could feel my heartbeat in the water, every pulse a declaration of presence, and it occurred to me that neglecting Rule 4 had made me visible in ways that weren't just metaphorical. Even the water seemed aware of me, pressing against my movements, testing the limits of my patience and fear. Hours, or what the instruments suggested were hours, passed, and I began to comprehend the full consequences. The line, which had seemed a simple lifeline, was a tether in every sense to sanity, to orientation, and perhaps to life itself. The trench, the shadows, and the faintly glowing organisms responded to its neglect, creating anomalies that disoriented my perception. I realized then that Rule 4 was about more than safety. It was about acknowledging that the deep tracks every action, remembers every lapse, and reacts to negligence with a patience that humans cannot comprehend. When I finally stabilized my grip and followed the line back toward my partner, I noticed that the shadows hadn't entirely receded. They lingered along the edges, just beyond the camera's illumination, as if marking me, cataloging my mistake. Every photograph I had taken captured not only the wreckage, but also something else, slight distortions, elongated shapes, and angles that shouldn't exist underwater. I understood then that my error in leaving the dive line unattended had consequences that extended beyond that single dive, echoing in both perception and recorded images, leaving subtle marks on the world I couldn't erase. Even on subsequent dives, I couldn't shake the effect of the first violation. I would hesitate before moving away from the line, checking grips, anchors, and tethers obsessively. Every shadow, every current, every reflective surface seemed to whisper reminders, echoes of what happens when Rule 4 is ignored. My camera, once a tool for discovery, had become a measure of accountability, recording evidence of the abyss's attention to detail. I realized that the ocean, patient and deliberate, does not forgive errors in judgment. It remembers and adapts, shaping consequences in ways no human could predict. The psychological weight of the lesson persisted long after I returned to surface. Sleep was uneasy, dreams populated by shadows clinging to lines, moving against currents, waiting just beyond reach. Even mundane tasks, checking rigging, adjusting equipment, reviewing footage, became exercises in hyper-awareness, constantly reminding me of the tether I had nearly lost. I understood that Rule 4 was not merely procedural, it was a rule of attention, focus, and respect. To violate it was to invite observation, engagement, and consequences that might extend far beyond what the eyes can see. I realized Rule 5. Never capture creatures in your photos that you cannot see directly on a dive, that began with calm confidence, the kind of arrogance only a diver with hundreds of hours under their belt could feel. I had been tracking a school of translucent squid, their bioluminescence flickering faintly in the depths, and thought I could manipulate the camera to capture what my eyes couldn't fully follow. At first it seemed harmless, a way to record the subtle patterns of life in a region too dark to observe unaided. But the moment I glanced at the monitor and saw movement in places my eyes hadn't registered, a ripple of unease shot through me, as though I had just drawn attention to myself in a place that didn't want to be noticed. The more I zoomed in on the screen, the more I realized the shapes weren't ordinary marine life. They twisted, moved, and aligned in ways the water didn't allow. I attempted to adjust the lighting to clarify, but doing so seemed to make the presences stronger, more defined. Shadows elongated in directions inconsistent with the flow, and in some frames, I could swear I saw glints of something metallic or reflective moving against the faint light. My stomach tightened as I understood the subtle gravity of violating Rule 5, though I didn't yet fully grasp why this rule existed. Something about capturing the unseen had consequences beyond mere observation. It invited interaction. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself the camera was malfunctioning, or that fatigue was playing tricks on me. Yet the moments in the footage seemed deliberate, frames containing entities that didn't exist in the immediate water, and I realized that every time I documented the unseen, the environment responded. Currents shifted minutely, shadows condensed along unexpected edges, and my own reflection in the lens appeared distorted, almost as if observing me back. The deeper I dove, the more obvious it became. This was no ordinary marine behavior, no quirk of light or motion. Rule 5 was a boundary, a line I had stepped over, and now the abyss was aware of it. As I continued, the creatures, or whatever they were, began to move more purposefully, drifting into frames I hadn't aimed at. I could feel the water around me thicken subtly, pressing against my suit like a living weight. Every motion of my hands, every tilt of the rig seemed magnified, each correction resisted by the ocean itself. The squid I had been documenting became almost secondary, their movements now predictable, while the unseen presences began to dominate the frame. I whispered under my regulator, "Don't, just don't," hoping that acknowledgement could somehow mitigate the mistake. But the water remained silent, sentient and unyielding. Time became slippery. Seconds stretched, folding in on themselves as I realized my perception was unreliable. Every glance at the monitor revealed anomalies I couldn't interpret, elongated shadows, forms that seemed to pulse in patterns that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. My rational mind fought panic, but every instinct screamed that the unseen entities I had captured were no longer passive. I tried to avert the camera, to focus only on what I could see directly, yet the moment I did, faint shapes emerged in peripheral frames, as though the water itself were revealing its patience and its memory. I understood that Rule 5 existed, because to photograph the unseen was to acknowledge it, and acknowledgement in this environment had consequences. The pressure of the abyss pressed inward, subtle at first, then insistent, creating a sense of unease that I could not ignore. I noticed that my instruments were fluctuating, displaying depth and orientation in ways that didn't match my perception. The water around me felt heavy, as though saturated with awareness. Shadows extended, condensed and stretched against surfaces that should have been inert, and the creatures I could not see directly seemed to trace my movements. Panic began to edge into rational thought, forcing me to confront the realization that capturing the unseen was a violation on a scale far beyond anything I had previously encountered. Even as I tried to compose myself, a subtle shift in the current made me drift closer to a crevice, and in that moment, something moved within the darkness, something enormous and deliberate. My hands froze on the camera, and I realized that the images I had already taken were more than records. They were invitations, markers that I had left for a force that now followed me. My heart raced, and I whispered apologies into the regulator, though I knew nothing could erase what had been done. Rule 5 was not merely about photography. It was a recognition of forces that could manipulate reality, perception, and intention. The creatures, or whatever they were, became increasingly difficult to ignore. In some frames, they seemed almost playful, dancing just out of reach, teasing my perception, manipulating my sense of space. In others, they seemed patient, observing, waiting for me to make a mistake, to capture them fully, and draw consequences into my immediate experience. I realized that I had underestimated the deep entirely. The environment wasn't passive, and my tools were not neutral. Every time I attempted to capture what I couldn't see, I interacted with something that existed in a dimension or awareness beyond my understanding. I tried to retreat to safer depths, to focus only on what I could directly perceive, but the water seemed to resist, currents subtly pushing me into positions that allowed glimpses of the unseen entities. Every correction felt like a negotiation with an intelligence I could neither measure nor reason with. I felt exhausted, my mind fraying, yet unable to stop documenting. Each frame became a small confession of my arrogance, a record of my transgression. I understood then that obeying Rule 5 was as much about maintaining sanity as survival, about respecting a boundary that was imperceptible yet absolute. When I finally surfaced, my colleagues remarked on the beauty of the footage, oblivious to the distortions and presences I had captured. Reviewing the recordings later, I noticed frames shifting subtly, shadows elongating and compressing, forms appearing and disappearing in impossible ways. The creatures I had documented indirectly were persistent, embedded not only in the water but in memory, leaving a residue of awareness that made sleep uneasy. Even months later, the subtle pressure of that violation lingered, reminding me that Rule 5 was not a guideline, it was a mandate. Now, before every dive, I checked the angles, currents, and potential blind spots obsessively. I avoid photographing anything I cannot see directly, measuring every line of sight and anticipating shadows. The ocean itself seems to approve of compliance, providing moments of calm, while even the smallest oversight provokes immediate and subtle reminders that the deep does not forgive easily. I understand finally that Rule 5 is a rule of attention, respect, and survival, and that ignoring it once is enough to invite consequences that linger indefinitely. I discovered Rule 6: never enter areas where light refuses to penetrate during a dive that began with overconfidence. The kind only comes from hours spent mapping familiar reefs and wrecks. The water was unusually dark that day, deep and thick, almost as if the ocean had absorbed every stray photon before I even descended. At first I thought I could push a little further, to map the trench walls that seemed to vanish into blackness. I told myself the lights on my rig would be enough, but the moment I crossed the threshold, the beam seemed to fracture, unable to penetrate beyond a certain distance. The water felt different there, heavier, colder, almost viscous, and a sense of being observed crept in, subtle but undeniable. As I hovered at the edge of the impenetrable darkness, my equipment reflected fragments of the world above, but the shadows ahead resisted every ray of light I cast. I realized too late that my curiosity had drawn me into a space that had no intention of being seen. The water around me seemed to hold its breath, and every motion created ripples that traveled strangely, bending in directions that defied physics. The deeper I ventured, the more disoriented I became. Even my instruments behaved inconsistently, depth readings fluctuating, compass needles twitching. The ocean wasn't simply dark, it was deliberate, patient and aware, reminding me that Rule 6 existed for a reason I had yet to comprehend fully. I tried to retreat, but the further I moved back toward lighter water, the more I noticed subtle disturbances, shadows along the trench walls that weren't there before, shapes lingering just beyond the edges of visibility, moving as if aware of my gaze. My own reflection in the glass of the camera seemed warped, elongated, and subtly wrong, and I realized that my presence alone had altered the space. I whispered into the regulator, telling myself it was merely fatigue, yet the pressure in my chest suggested otherwise. The ocean in these zones was sentient in a way I could not articulate, responding to intrusion with measured resistance, a quiet force that made each decision a negotiation for survival. Minutes, or what felt like minutes, passed as I navigated cautiously, every movement deliberate, every adjustment to the rig painstakingly slow. I could feel something in the dark, not visible but palpably present, shaping the water around me, nudging currents subtly, guiding me toward areas I had no reason to explore. Each frame I captured showed anomalies I hadn't noticed in the moment, faint glimmers of shapes that did not correspond to any known life form, shadows that refused to align with natural contours, and distortions that warped the trench walls in impossible ways. Panic began to seep in, a low pressure that twisted my thoughts, and I understood that Rule 6 was about more than light. It was about acknowledging limits that exist beyond human comprehension. The deeper I moved, the more the darkness seemed to thicken, almost like a physical presence pressing against my suit. The light from my rig became diffused, stretching and bending unpredictably, casting eerie halos around unseen objects. I realized that my camera was capturing not just light, but subtle interactions in the water itself, trails of unseen presences, shifts in density, and fleeting glimpses of forms that retreated the moment I tried to focus on them. The ocean, patient and unyielding, was testing me, marking me for ignoring the natural boundary, and I understood then that Rule 6 wasn't optional, it was survival. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed as I hovered near the edge, documenting what I could without crossing further into the darkness. Every time I aimed the camera toward the abyss, the water reacted, twisting slightly, shadows elongating and condensing, reflections misaligning with reality. I could feel the pressure in my chest grow heavier, subtle at first, then almost unbearable, as if the ocean itself were judging my persistence. The creatures I had previously photographed seemed distant, irrelevant, while the deep black void ahead held a presence I could neither see nor ignore. My rational mind tried to dismiss the sensation, but instinct screamed that the boundary was there for a reason, and I was testing it. At one point, a form moved in the darkness, impossibly swift and deliberate. I couldn't see it directly, but its presence distorted the surrounding water, twisting currents and creating shadows that shifted independently. I tried to move backward, but the water resisted, tugging gently yet firmly, a subtle reminder of the consequence of intrusion. The beam of light fractured further, scattering in directions I could not control, and every adjustment I made seemed to amplify the presence rather than mitigate it. I realized then that ignoring Rule 6 had created a tether between myself and this unseen force, one I could not simply sever by retreating. By the time I surfaced, my suit drenched in cold sweat and my hands shaking uncontrollably, the lesson had been seared into my memory. Reviewing footage later, I noticed distortions that defied explanation, patches of darkness that appeared deeper than reality, faint glimmers of movement where nothing should have existed, and reflections that warped subtly across every frame. The ocean had left its mark, a quiet but persistent reminder that areas devoid of light are not empty, they are watched, shaped, and remembered. The blackness was patient, deliberate, and it waited for any misstep with perfect awareness. In the weeks that followed, the psychological effect lingered. I found myself obsessively checking lighting and angles before every dive, measuring every shadow and calculating how much illumination to cast without disturbing unseen forms. Even mundane tasks, reviewing footage, calibrating cameras, triggered faint panic, a memory of the oppressive presence in the unlit zones. I realized that Rule 6 was as much about preserving mental stability as physical survival, and that any lapse in judgment could invite consequences that extended far beyond immediate danger. Now, before every dive, I mentally mark the boundaries where light refuses to penetrate. I avoid probing too deeply, limit exposure, and double-check equipment to ensure I never stray into zones I cannot safely illuminate. Even the smallest oversight, a flicker of light into uncharted darkness, feels like an invitation to forces I cannot see, cannot measure, and cannot predict. The ocean has a memory that persists beyond my dives, a patience that is as terrifying as it is infinite, and Rule 6 remains engraved in every cautious movement I make. I realized Rule 7. Never allow equipment to float beyond arm's reach. During a dive that started innocently enough, cataloging the remnants of a sunken cargo vessel, the water was dense and cold, carrying an eerie stillness that pressed against my skin like an unseen hand. My camera rig, lights, and measurement devices were tethered, but not secured tightly, and I thought I could rely on buoyancy to hold everything near. I glanced away for a second, adjusting a dial on my console, and when I looked back, one of my smaller instruments had drifted a few inches farther than it should have. The moment was fleeting, but the consequences were immediate. The water seemed to pull at it, tugging subtly, as if testing my attention. I reached for it instinctively, only to feel resistance, a gentle but undeniable force opposing my motion. The instrument swayed as if caught in currents that didn't exist, and shadows in the surrounding water thickened subtly, condensing into forms that felt aware of my negligence. I realized then that Rule 7 was not just about convenience or retrieval. It was about proximity to forces I could not fully comprehend, and allowing equipment to drift was akin to opening a door into the unknown. Every adjustment I made sent ripples through the water, shifting angles and reflections in ways I couldn't predict, and I began to feel the first stirrings of panic. The deeper I descended, the more pronounced the effects became. My tethered lights, though still functional, seemed to create distortions beyond what was normal. Beams bent unexpectedly, shadows moved independently, and my own silhouette stretched unnaturally in the dim glow. The drifting instrument became almost magnetic in its motion, pulled by currents invisible to the eye, and I felt a subtle pressure behind my thoughts, like awareness pressing at the edges of perception. The water was patient, but deliberate, and I understood that Rule 7 existed not merely for physical safety, but to maintain a fragile equilibrium with the environment, one that could unravel in a second of distraction. Minutes stretched endlessly as I fought to retrieve the rogue equipment. Each tug I applied met resistance that felt purposeful, almost intelligent, and the shadows surrounding me seemed to lean closer, as if observing my struggle. The camera captured anomalies in the water, shapes that warped and elongated, currents twisting unnaturally, and faint glimmers of movement where nothing should have existed. My heartbeat quickened with every frame, and I realized that allowing even a single piece of equipment to escape my immediate control could summon consequences far beyond what I had anticipated. As I stabilized my grip on the drifting instrument, I noticed other objects in my peripheral vision subtly shifting, moving against currents that should have dictated their paths. Small debris, sediment, and marine life all seemed to respond to the anomaly I had created, twisting and floating in patterns that were deliberate and impossible to ignore. My hands shook on the rig as I whispered warnings under my regulator, trying to remind myself of the lesson in Rule 7, but the water remained silent yet insistent, pressing against my focus, testing my patience and composure. The more I attempted to correct the situation, the more I realized the presence surrounding me wasn't entirely passive. The shadows and currents seemed to mirror my actions, anticipating every adjustment, almost mocking my attempts to regain control. I felt a creeping dread, a subtle psychological erosion that came not from danger I could see, but from understanding that the deep had memory, intent, and patience. My fingers tightened around the equipment, and I realized that Rule 7 wasn't just a procedural guideline, it was a boundary, one whose violation could subtly, insidiously, alter my perception, my control, and my safety. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed in a blur as I clung to the tethered instruments. The shadows shifted independently of my light sources, forming shapes that seemed almost sentient, following the rogue equipment in silent anticipation. My mind strained to interpret the visual cues, what was reflection, what was distortion, and what was truly something alive in the water. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but the compulsion to maintain order kept me focused. I understood then that Rule 7 was about more than preventing a lost instrument. It was about maintaining proximity to what the abyss might exploit, ensuring that negligence didn't invite consequences too subtle to anticipate yet too severe to ignore. When I finally secured all my equipment, the water around me seemed to relax only slightly, though not entirely. The shadows lingered, shifting in ways that suggested awareness and patience, and I realized that the deep never forgets. Every lapse leaves a trace, a subtle imprint that can amplify over time, shaping currents, shadows, and perception itself. I understood that Rule 7 was about maintaining vigilance in an environment that reacts to the smallest errors, a rule that taught respect through persistent psychological pressure rather than immediate physical harm. Even after surfacing, I could feel the effects of my mistake. Reviewing footage later, I noticed subtle distortions, reflections and angles that defied logic, and movement in areas that should have been static. The rogue instrument's drift had been minor, almost inconsequential, yet it had altered the environment in ways I could not control. The lesson persisted, a quiet pressure in my mind, a reminder that Rule 7 existed not for convenience, but for survival, awareness, and respect for forces beyond comprehension. On subsequent dives, I developed a meticulous system for equipment management. Every tether, light, camera, and sensor was checked repeatedly, angles and buoyancy calculated precisely, and I never allowed a single instrument to float beyond reach. Even minor adjustments were performed with exaggerated care, knowing that the abyss notices, remembers, and reacts. Every frame captured, every object managed, became a silent acknowledgement of the environment's power and the necessity of following Rule 7. The psychological imprint of that incident lingers. I find myself watching shadows and movements obsessively, anticipating disturbances that might arise from equipment drifting too far, even in controlled conditions. The ocean has memory, patience, and awareness that transcends my understanding, and I have learned that proximity is not just convenience, it is survival. Rule 7 is a constant, a rule whose violation has consequences that ripple subtly, persisting far beyond the moment of oversight. I learned Rule 8. Never record anything that appears to be watching you during a dive that started with routine documentation of an old underwater research station. The water was murky, filled with sediment from decades of neglect, and the faint glow of my lights barely penetrated the gloom. I had been capturing static frames of rusted hallways and collapsed equipment when I noticed a reflection, or maybe a shadow, that felt impossibly deliberate. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a trick of light on the corroded panels, but then the movement synchronized with my own. It was subtle, faint, and unnervingly precise, and in that moment, I realized I had violated Rule 8 by pointing my lens at something that wasn't meant to be observed. The presence felt patient, deliberate, and almost sentient. It didn't move in a way I could predict, yet every subtle flicker of its attention mirrored my own motions. My heart rate spiked, and I tried to rationalize the sensation, blaming currents, reflections, or my own nerves. But the longer I observed, the more impossible it became to deny whatever I was filming was aware. The shadow shifted just beyond the reach of my light, and for a split second, I could swear I saw a form, humanoid, perhaps, yet distorted by pressure and darkness. I whispered apologies under my regulator, knowing that acknowledgement might be too late. Every frame I captured seemed to reinforce its awareness. The water itself seemed to pulse subtly, currents bending in ways that drew my attention repeatedly toward the same spot. I tried to look away, to focus on empty corridors and static wreckage, but the presence shifted with me, always appearing at the edge of visibility. The camera became an extension of my perception, a tether that connected me to something patient and observing. I understood then that Rule 8 was about maintaining distance from attention itself. Recording what watches you invites consequences that are slow, insidious, and unavoidable. I attempted to retreat down a side corridor, moving cautiously to keep both myself and the camera oriented away from the observing shadow. Yet the water seemed to resist, currents subtly nudging me back toward the same spot, reflections flickering with shapes that weren't my own. Panic started to seep into rational thought, making my hands shake, my grip on the rig unsteady. Every time I turned the camera elsewhere, faint traces appeared in the frames, shapes bending and twisting, as if aware of the shift. It was impossible to ignore, impossible to rationalize, and I understood that Rule 8 wasn't about what I could see. It was about what I couldn't escape once observed. The deeper I ventured into the station, the more the presence intensified. Shadows lengthened unnaturally along walls. Corrosion and sediment reflected light in patterns that felt almost deliberate, and subtle currents carried a pressure that pressed against my chest. I realized that recording was no longer neutral. Every frame I captured strengthened the tether, drew attention, and confirmed the presence's awareness of me. The thought made my stomach knot, but the compulsion to document, to understand, was stronger than fear. Each adjustment to the camera, each change in angle, only reinforced my connection to the observing entity. Hours, or what my instruments suggested were hours, passed in a blur of tension. The presence never revealed itself fully. It remained just at the edge of visibility, sometimes vanishing entirely for frames at a time. Yet in the footage, I could see it moving. Subtle distortions, slight ripples in water that had been still, faint patterns in reflection that weren't part of the wreckage. It became increasingly clear that Rule 8 wasn't about safety in the traditional sense. It was about perception and awareness. Acknowledging observation through recording creates a chain of consequence that begins subtly and grows relentless over time. I tried to convince myself that surfacing would break the connection, that leaving the site behind would sever any tether I had inadvertently formed. Yet even in open water, away from the station, I felt it, subtle pressure in the periphery, shapes lingering just beyond the edge of my vision, currents tugging slightly at my rig. The camera felt heavier, almost responsive, as though it had absorbed some memory of the presence. Reviewing footage later confirmed my worst fears. Frames captured anomalies that were not there when I looked directly. Shadows moving independently, shapes shifting against logic. Rule 8 had been violated, and the consequences extended far beyond the immediate dive. In the days following, my sleep became fractured, haunted by images of shadowed forms at the edges of rooms, lurking in frames I had taken. Even mundane reflective surfaces triggered unease. Windows, polished metal, pools of rainwater. I found myself obsessively checking recordings, measuring angles, and considering every possibility of what might have been observing me. The lesson was clear: recording what watches you is not simply dangerous, it is an invitation into a subtle, persistent awareness that lingers and adapts, reshaping perception and thought. Subsequent dives were approached with extreme caution. I checked every angle, monitored light, and avoided documenting anything that even hinted at awareness. Shadows and reflections became triggers for obsessive scrutiny, and I realized that the presence I had recorded once might still be aware, patient, and deliberate in its observation. Rule 8 was now ingrained in every movement I made underwater, a rule of acknowledgement, respect, and survival, guiding every choice of what to capture, what to leave unseen, and how to maintain the fragile boundary between observation and interaction. Even months later, the psychological imprint of violating Rule 8 persists. Every frame I take underwater is approached with hyper-awareness, every shadow scrutinized, every light adjusted to avoid drawing attention. The ocean has memory, patience, and a subtle intelligence, and recording what observes you creates a chain of consequence that cannot be undone. I understand now that Rule 8 is not about fear of immediate harm. It is about survival through respect, maintaining awareness, and avoiding engagement with forces that persist far beyond what the eyes can detect. I realized Rule 9: never ignore sudden changes in water pressure on a dive that began like any other, methodical and cautious, documenting a collapsed subsea observatory. The current was gentle, predictable, almost hypnotic, and I was adjusting my lights when I felt a subtle tightening around my chest, a sensation so fleeting I almost ignored it. But then it intensified, a slow, insistent compression that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my own heartbeat. At first, I told myself it was my suit or regulator, a mechanical hiccup, yet the sensation persisted and shifted, pressing unevenly, as if the water itself had decided to mark me. I remembered the warning, Rule 9, and my confidence faltered. The abyss had a way of amplifying mistakes into consequences I couldn't control. The pressure wasn't uniform. It pressed from angles that defied logic, and I realized it wasn't simply physical. It felt deliberate. My hands shook as I tried to adjust my buoyancy, each movement resisted by currents that twisted unnaturally, bending water around my body. Shadows along the walls thickened in response to the compression, stretching and condensing in ways that felt aware of my panic. Even my instruments behaved erratically. Depth gauges flickered, compasses spun, and lights refracted in unpredictable patterns. The abyss seemed patient, silent, observing, and I understood that Rule 9 wasn't about equipment or procedures. It was about the environment itself, subtle, deliberate, and capable of shaping perception. I attempted to ascend slowly, recalibrating my position, but the deeper I moved, the more the pressure responded. It wasn't merely resistance, it was tactile awareness, pressing against my suit and squeezing the water around me in deliberate currents. My camera rig felt heavier, shadows stretched unnaturally, and reflections appeared in places they shouldn't have existed. Panic pressed at the edges of my mind, but logic urged me to focus, to remember that sudden pressure changes were not to be ignored. Every inhale felt like a negotiation, every movement a test of resolve, and I realized that Rule 9 was about more than avoiding injury. It was about survival in a space that responded to both action and inaction with equal consequence. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Currents twisted in impossible directions. Sediment and small debris floated upward briefly before descending, and the faint luminescence of marine life shimmered unnaturally. The pressure fluctuated, pulsing in rhythm with shadows that seemed to stretch along walls, reacting to my presence, my movements, and the slight tremor of fear I could not conceal. I whispered apologies under my regulator, a silent plea that felt as futile as it was instinctive. Each movement I made seemed to create a response, as if the abyss had memory and intent, punishing lapses in attention with subtle yet unrelenting force. At one point, I felt a shift so sudden it knocked the wind from my lungs, sending my rig swinging violently. The shadows condensed, elongating along fractured surfaces of the wreck, and faint shapes flickered at the edges of my vision, forms that were impossible to categorize. I realized that ignoring Rule 9 had done more than place me in physical danger. It had drawn the attention of something patient, deliberate, and aware. Every attempt to regain control met with resistance, subtle but undeniable, and I understood that the lesson of pressure was also a lesson of attention, vigilance, and respect for forces beyond comprehension. Time became distorted, depth readings twisted, shadows shifted independently of light, and every adjustment I attempted seemed to amplify the sensations. Currents pressed differently against each limb, creating disorientation that was both physical and psychological. The water was no longer neutral. It felt deliberate, almost sentient, a silent monitor testing my adherence to the rule. My heartbeat echoed in my ears, synchronized with the pulsing of pressure around me, and I realized that Rule 9 was more than procedure. It was acknowledgement that the environment was patient, observant, and unforgiving to negligence. As I struggled to navigate back to familiar areas of the observatory, every surface seemed warped, angles shifting subtly with the pressure changes. Shadows condensed, spreading across the wreck in patterns I couldn't anticipate. Even my own reflection in the camera glass appeared distorted, elongated, and misaligned, creating a sense of disorientation that was nearly overwhelming. The longer I ignored the pressures, the more aware I became of a subtle intelligence in the abyss, one that monitored every lapse, every hesitation, every flicker of distraction. Rule 9 was no longer just a guideline. It was a measure of awareness, attention, and survival. Hours, or what my instruments claimed were hours, passed, and I began to comprehend the persistent effect. The deeper I descended, the more the water seemed alive, moving against me in deliberate waves, pressing unevenly, shifting in ways that defied physics. The equipment, the rig, even small debris responded to the pressure, altering orientation, reflection, and perception. I understood finally that ignoring Rule 9 wasn't just a physical risk, it was a psychological trap. The abyss remembers every lapse, manipulates perception, and uses pressure as a subtle but insistent reminder that mistakes are never forgotten. When I finally surfaced, gasping and drenched, my hands trembling, the lesson had burned into my consciousness. Reviewing footage later, distortions appeared in angles that didn't match what I had seen directly. Shadows shifted, reflections warped, and the faintest traces of movement appeared where nothing should have existed. Even the simplest frame held evidence of the subtle punishment for ignoring sudden changes in water pressure. The ocean, patient and deliberate, had marked me, leaving a psychological imprint that would endure far beyond that single dive. In the weeks following, I became obsessively meticulous in monitoring depth, pressure, and currents. Each adjustment to equipment, tethering, and positioning was made with extreme care, conscious of even minor fluctuations in water behavior. Shadows, reflections, and light angles became triggers for careful observation, and I realized that Rule 9 was less about danger in the moment, and more about maintaining vigilance, awareness, and respect for the subtle intelligence of the deep. Every lapse had a cost, and every observation was a negotiation with a patient, sentient environment that remembered mistakes indefinitely. Even now, months later, my dives are conducted with an almost ritualistic adherence to pressure monitoring. Every instrument is checked, every adjustment measured, every shadow scrutinized. I've come to understand that Rule 9 is not just about the immediate risk of injury or equipment failure. It is about acknowledging the subtle responsiveness of the abyss. Ignoring sudden changes in water pressure creates consequences that ripple through perception, control, and awareness, leaving psychological and physical marks that persist long after the dive ends. I learned Rule 10. Never remove protective seals from unknown compartments on a dive. That began with cautious curiosity, investigating an abandoned subsea research lab buried beneath layers of sediment and rust. The water was dense and sluggish, carrying a sense of age and neglect that pressed subtly against my skin. I had been documenting the exterior walls when I noticed a series of metal compartments along a partially collapsed corridor. Most were sealed, their edges encrusted with salt and corrosion, but one had a faintly rusted latch just slightly loosened. I reached out, instinctively, my hand hovering above it, and remembered the rule, Rule 10. The moment my fingers brushed the latch, the water shifted, currents tugging subtly at my limbs as though discouraging my action. Shadows along the corridor walls thickened, bending light in ways that seemed impossible. For an instant, I hesitated, reminding myself that seals exist for a reason: to protect, to isolate, to prevent exposure to unknown forces. Yet curiosity, I would regret, pushed me to disengage the latch. The seal released slowly, an almost imperceptible creak amplified by the surrounding silence, and I felt a faint pressure, like a warning, ripple through the water. I knew immediately that Rule 10 wasn't about equipment maintenance. It was about boundaries I wasn't meant to cross. Inside the compartment, darkness pressed in thicker than the water around me, and the light from my rig barely penetrated. Objects were scattered, jars of chemicals, tools corroded into unrecognizable forms, and equipment that seemed to have been left in a hurry. I tried to record everything with the camera, but the moment I pointed it directly, I noticed subtle distortions in the water, currents twisting unnaturally, shadows condensing and stretching along walls. The deeper I tried to investigate, the more the environment seemed aware of my intrusion. It wasn't just pressure or visibility, it was a sense of being watched, assessed, and judged for violating the compartment's protective seal. Minutes passed, or felt like them, as I gingerly examined the contents. The moment I removed a jar, sediment shifted in ways that shouldn't have been possible, flowing upward briefly before settling back. Tiny particles in the water seemed to orient toward me, drifting unnaturally, and reflections on my rig bent in ways that contradicted physics. I whispered to myself, a barely audible confession, realizing I had crossed a threshold that was not meant to be crossed. Rule 10 was now alive in my consciousness, a reminder that these compartments were not random storage, they were warnings, and I had chosen to ignore one. The deeper I explored the compartment, the more the water responded. Currents seemed deliberate, pressing subtly against my movements, guiding me towards certain areas while discouraging others. Shadows condensed along fractured walls, shapes forming just beyond the edges of visibility. I began to notice faint luminescent glimmers, not from biological life, but from reflections of metal and glass, twisted in ways that defied the normal rules of light. Every motion, every reach, every slight disturbance of sediment created a ripple in the water that felt almost sentient. I realized that Rule 10 wasn't about the act itself. It was about the environment's response, a patient, deliberate countermeasure to transgression. Hours, or what my instruments suggested were hours, passed as I carefully documented without touching anything further. Yet the water continued to shift unpredictably, currents bending, shadows thickening, and reflections warping. I noticed that objects I had glanced at seconds before seemed subtly displaced, as if they had moved independently in response to my gaze. The ocean was patient, deliberate, and impossibly aware. My mind strained to reconcile reality with observation, realizing that every moment I lingered in violation of Rule 10 amplified my exposure to consequences I could neither measure nor predict. At one point, the compartment seemed to expand around me, walls stretching in angles that should have been impossible, shadows shifting independently of my light source. I could feel a presence, subtle and unyielding, pressing against the periphery of perception. Even the equipment I had tethered reacted, swinging gently against currents that I could not account for. I understood that removing the seal had not merely opened a door, it had invited awareness, engagement, and observation by something patient and persistent in the environment. Every breath I took, every movement I made, confirmed the rule's relevance. Attempting to retreat from the compartment, I noticed that the water itself seemed denser near the seal, currents twisting subtly to impede my exit. The shadows along the corridor shifted as I moved, and faint luminescent glimmers appeared along edges that had been dark moments before. I realized that Rule 10 had more impact than I initially understood. Opening a sealed compartment invited forces into the immediate space, altering perception, movement, and balance. My body tensed as I maneuvered the rig, careful not to disturb sediment unnecessarily, yet even minimal disturbance was amplified by the environment's patient response. When I finally secured the latch again, I felt a subtle shift in the water, currents easing slightly, shadows relaxing along walls, yet the pressure in the corridor lingered, a psychological residue of my transgression. Reviewing the footage later, I noticed anomalies in every frame, distortions in reflections, currents appearing to twist against natural physics, and subtle glimmers in areas I hadn't noticed at the time. Even the tiniest movements of my equipment had been observed, recorded, and responded to by the environment. Rule 10 had been violated, and the lesson persisted beyond the dive, a constant reminder of the ocean's patience and awareness. In the weeks following, I became obsessively meticulous with compartment seals, examining every surface for corrosion, potential breaches, and proper closure before interacting. I measured every angle, monitored currents, and avoided opening anything without clear purpose and caution. The psychological imprint of that single violation remained, a quiet pressure in the mind that surfaced whenever I approached unfamiliar structures underwater. I realized that Rule 10 is not about immediate danger, it is about acknowledgement of boundaries, attention to consequence, and respect for forces that respond subtly yet deliberately. Even months later, before every dive, I inspect every seal, latch, and panel with ritualistic attention. Shadows, reflections, and water currents are scrutinized for subtle anomalies, a persistent reminder of the patient consequences of transgression. I have come to understand that Rule 10 is less about physical safety than maintaining awareness of the environment's responsiveness. Ignoring protective seals is never a neutral act. It invites observation, manipulation, and subtle disruption that can echo long after the compartment is resealed. I discovered Rule 11. Never look directly at anomalies reflected in metallic surfaces during a dive that began with a sense of tired confidence. Cataloging the remains of a long-abandoned submarine research platform. The water was still unusually clear for this depth, and the faint light from my rig danced across corroded metal, like fragile filaments. I noticed the gleam of polished panels and rusted equipment reflecting faintly in the beams, and curiosity urged me to focus on them. For a moment, I allowed my eyes to track the reflections, thinking only of capturing their decay on camera, unaware that the water seemed to respond to my gaze. The instant I did, subtle distortions appeared in the reflections, elongated shadows, bending light, forms that twisted impossibly, and I realized I had violated Rule 11. The anomalies were impossible to classify. At first, I thought they were tricks of light or corrosion, but soon shapes moved against the expected flow of water, reflections warping independently of physical reality. Shadows bent, stretched, and condensed in ways that defied comprehension, and every movement I made seemed anticipated. My heart thudded against my chest as the reflections twisted further, shapes flickering at impossible angles. I tried to avert my gaze, but the water itself resisted, subtly pressing me toward the metallic surfaces, guiding my focus despite my instincts. I understood then that Rule 11 was less about observation and more about control. Once acknowledged directly, anomalies could manipulate perception, behavior, and attention in ways that were impossible to resist. Minutes or perhaps hours passed in a blur of distorted perception. The deeper I looked, the more the reflections seemed to pull at my awareness, bending the world around me. Metallic panels that should have been inert now appeared fluid, twisting and pulsing subtly, while shadows elongated across surfaces that weren't actually present. Currents responded to my movements, small eddies twisting unnaturally, and the rig of lights and cameras became almost an extension of the distortions. Every attempt to document the anomalies exacerbated them, amplifying their effect on my perception and drawing me further into their influence. Rule 11 was no longer a caution, it was a tether, a subtle chain linking my attention to something patient, deliberate, and infinitely aware. I tried to break eye contact with the reflections, forcing my focus to solid surfaces and familiar instruments, but the anomalies remained. Even in frames captured by the camera, I could see them shift independently of my adjustments. The pressure of the water intensified subtly, pressing unevenly against my suit and equipment, and shadows condensed in unnatural patterns. I whispered under my regulator, a quiet confession and plea for the sensation to stop, but the presence persisted, patient and deliberate. It became clear that looking directly had activated a chain reaction. The anomalies weren't passive, and their awareness of me was now absolute. Each movement through the platform became a negotiation with the distortions. I found myself instinctively avoiding reflective surfaces, calculating angles to prevent accidental glances, yet the anomalies seemed to anticipate my navigation. Currents nudged me toward unexpected paths, shadows thickened in peripheral vision, and faint glimmers appeared where there should have been only darkness. The camera captured subtle traces, elongations, bends and distortions that weren't visible to the naked eye, a record of forces that responded to observation. I realized that Rule 11 existed because the anomalies could influence perception, manipulate attention, and trap awareness in ways that were nearly impossible to escape. Hours blurred as I navigated through corridors lined with corroded metal, careful to avoid reflections and maintain strict control over the rig. Yet every polished surface, every glint of light against glass or steel, seemed to pulse with awareness, subtle but undeniable. Shadows shifted independently of any natural source, and currents twisted in response to my slightest movement. The presence of the anomalies felt like a pressure behind perception itself, a tug at attention that could not be fully resisted. I understood that ignoring Rule 11 could unravel even the most cautious dive, distorting not only what I saw, but how I understood my environment. At one point, a panel reflected a shape I could not describe, elongated, flickering, shifting between solid and fluid forms with impossible geometry. I averted my eyes immediately, but the ripple in my perception remained, bending the light around me and creating subtle distortions in every corner of the room. The water felt heavier, currents twisting unpredictably, and I realized that the anomalies could manipulate not just vision, but spatial awareness, movement, and instinct. Even my carefully tethered equipment responded strangely, shifting against currents and angling subtly toward reflective surfaces. Every breath, every adjustment, every cautious step confirmed that Rule 11 was about more than avoidance. It was survival. I maneuvered through the platform with obsessive caution, keeping attention on solid, matte surfaces, yet the pressure of the anomalies persisted. Reflections in rusted panels, cables and instrument cases seemed to stretch impossibly, shadows twisting along walls in ways that contradicted physics. I could feel subtle tugging at my awareness, like attention being redirected by invisible forces. Even without direct visual contact, the anomalies' influence remained, a persistent reminder that Rule 11 was as much about psychological resilience as physical avoidance. Every choice, every glance, was now measured against the consequences of having broken the rule, and I realized the environment had memory, patience, and intent. By the time I surfaced, the psychological imprint of violating Rule 11 was indelible. Reviewing footage later, reflections appeared distorted in ways I hadn't consciously perceived. Bending light, shapes shifting independently of currents, and anomalies lurking at the edges of every frame. The experience had left a persistent pressure in my mind, an unshakable awareness that some observations are too dangerous to make directly. Even in familiar waters, metallic surfaces trigger subtle unease, a reminder that perception itself can be manipulated if the rule is broken. The lessons of Rule 11 were clear: attention, observation, and survival are intertwined in ways I had only begun to comprehend. Since then, every dive involves meticulous planning to avoid reflective surfaces, careful calculation of angles, and hyper-awareness of shadows and light. The anomalies never fully leave the mind. Their presence persists, subtle yet insistent, and every reflective glimmer is treated with caution bordering on obsession. I have learned that Rule 11 is not a suggestion, it is a boundary, a tether between awareness and survival, one that must never be crossed. Even months later, the psychological and perceptual echoes of that violation persist, shaping every movement and glance in the abyss. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.